Hey, what's up everybody? It's your boy Tristan Barrocks here, the digital storyteller, and I'm super excited to be with you for another episode of Cinecut. But not just any episode of Cinecut tutorials, where I'll teach you some tips and tricks that I use for all of my production work. In this episode, we'll be talking about how to get creamy, buttery, smooth, slow-mo footage from the Sony A7 Mark III. Are you ready? Let's go! Woo! All right, let me see this here. Oh, no. So I have the Sony A7 Mark III in my hand. I'm going to jump into the menu options and show you exactly what settings I turn on, what settings I turn off, what picture profiles I use to get the best, butteriest slow-mo footage possible. Then after that, I have a shoot a little bit later. I'm going to be filming that in super slow-mo, and then we'll bring it back into Final Cut Pro for me to color grade it and edit it down for you. And then you can see my process and some of the filters I use in Final Cut Pro. So first things first, we are in the first menu, or the first menu tab within the Sony A7 III options menu. Again, one of the things I don't really love about Sony is the fact that their menu systems are kind of convoluted. It takes a long time to get used to, and now I just kind of memorize which page I need to be on. But right now we're on folder menu 1 of 14, page 1 of 14, which again, to have 14 pages in one folder is kind of crazy. But anyways, I digress. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to jump right up, or press up and jump right to menu option number 2. The reason for that is because we just need to first and foremost set up our S&Q settings. So under S&Q settings, actually before you even get to S&Q settings, what I would do is I would change my exposure from any of the picture program modes to manual mode. And the reason why I choose manual mode is because then in real time I can make adjustments, and I'm not relying on the camera to make those adjustments for me. So again, you can go to, you know, the program auto mode, you can do aperture priority, you can do shutter priority. In my opinion, I think it's most important to be able to have fully manual modes that you're working in, so that you can do all the tweaking you want. Maybe you want a slower shutter, maybe you want a faster shutter, maybe you want to control the aperture, maybe you want to control the ISO. This gives you all the flexibility in the world. Next, we're going to go to the S&Q settings. So when we click on the S&Q settings, we have two distinct options, and this is where people sometimes get confused. There's the recording settings, and then there's the frame rate. Now, the difference between the two is very, very simple. The recording settings is essentially what you want the clip to ultimately play back in, what frame rate you want it to ultimately play back in. So if I click on recording settings, I have 3 different playback recording frame rates to choose from. I have 60 frames per second, I have 30 frames per second, and I have 24 frames per second. So depending on what kind of effect and what kind of mood and what kind of tone you're trying to create, you would pick the appropriate frames per second that you would want the clip to be converted into or played back into, okay? The frame rate settings determines how slow ultimately this clip will be. So if I pick 30 frames per second, if you look below, it says that it's going to record in XAVC SHD at 40 megabits per second, and it will be 1.25 slow motion, meaning at 24 frames per second, it's going to be 1.25 times slower. And that's as slow as the clip can be before the clip starts getting choppy and is not as smooth as you'd like it to be. Now, if I go to 60 frames per second, now all of a sudden we look down, it says that it's going to be recording at XAVC SHD at 21 megabits per second, which will give us 2.5 times the slow motion, which ultimately means that this 24 frame clip will be able to play back at 2.5 times slower of a speed because it's being recorded in 60 frames per second. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. If we go to 120 frames per second, what we're getting is we are getting 12 megabits per second at XAVC SHD, and we're getting 5 times slow motion. Obviously, the slower you want the footage to be in 24 frames or in 30 frames or in 60 frames, the lesser the quality. But again, once we bring it into Final Cut, you'll see how clean and how usable the footage is, regardless of the 12 megabits per second. I'm gonna hit menu, and we're almost done. We're literally more than halfway done. So again, we made sure that there was manual exposure for the S&Q mode, and then we also went to the S&Q settings, set up our record settings as well as our frame rate settings. Okay, and then what we're gonna do is we're gonna jump back into our first menu tab. We're gonna drop down, and I believe it's under menu or page number 12. There we go. Page number 12 will give us our picture profile settings. So I'm going to show you all the picture profiles as they show up. So we'll go through it like this. So this is no picture profile. This is picture profile 1, picture profile 2, picture profile 3, picture profile 4, picture profile 5, picture profile 6, picture profile 7, picture profile 8, picture profile 9, picture profile 10. Now, the picture profile that I like to use the most is picture profile number 7. The reason why I like picture profile 7 is because it still gives me the flexibility, because it is still a flatter sort of look. The only thing that it does is it bumps up the contrast a bit, so I don't have to add as much contrast to the image. I can actually just focus more on the color and the color correction, which is super dope for me. It speeds up my process a lot more, and that's why I like using it. And I found it to be really, really good for the slow motion, especially 120 frames per second slow-mo. But you can pick and test out all the different picture profiles that work for you. I particularly like picture profile number 7. So now, after you go through all your menu options and you set that up, you set up your picture profile, you set up your frame rates, you set up your deliverable recording rate that you want it to be at, which is 24 frames per second or 30 or 60. The last thing that you got to do is you got to make sure that you are on the right shutter speed. So shutter is the amount of times that the camera actually opens and closes its eyes, per se. Okay, in most scenarios you want to make sure that your shutter speed is double whatever your frame rate is. So for instance, if my frame rate is 24 frames per second, I should have a shutter of 50 or 48 frames per second, depending on what camera I use, whatever is closest to 48. If I have a frame rate of 30 frames per second, my shutter should be 60 frames per second, and so on and so forth. So if I have 60 frames, it should be 120. If I have 120, it should be 240. So right now I'm actually only, if you can see right here, I'm only at 125th shutter speed. So I'm going to change that to 250, and doubling up on my shutter speed is going to ensure that I get the best performance out of my slow motion. All right, so now that we have our Sony A7 Mark III all set up for slow-mo, let's go out, shoot some things, and then see what this bad boy produces for us. All right, let's go. So I have Final Cut Pro opened up here. I have my clips imported from a small shoot I just did earlier today from a local business in my town called Trainer Games. It's actually a really cool gym in my area, and I wanted to show you guys how I kind of treat this slow-mo footage. Now, one of the things you may notice, you may or may not notice, even though this footage is all in slow motion, it is absolutely clean. Like, it's really good. It's really nice and clean. Let me make this a little bit bigger so that you guys can see this a little bit better. Honestly, this is very, very usable footage. Very, very usable footage. And I will play this for you, play this back for you, so you can actually see the smoothness, the clarity of all this. Look at this. This footage is very, very usable. I kind of was racking focus there. I had a really shallow lens, but as you can see, the model was in focus. Even here, there's some really cool shots right here that I got. And this is very usable. There's not a lot of noise, a little bit of noise in the blacks here. But again, once I show you how I treat the footage, then you'll be able to kind of see exactly how you can get rid of that stuff. But again, very clean, very super buttery smooth footage. And again, that's why it's super important to make sure that we have double the shutter speed over the frame rate. So again, we were shooting at 120 frames per second, so I had to at least have a shutter of 240 or higher. This was at 250. I did have to bump up my ISO and maybe open up my aperture a little bit, and that's why the focusing was kind of like hit or miss. But when you're shooting at that speed, even if you miss the focus a little bit, it can still be usable. I'll even show you this right here. We have Anthony doing some running right here, and you can see everything, all the slow-mo. I'll do this clip right here. So I'm just gonna grab a little part of that clip, press E. All right, and this is the clip that we have right now of this young lady skipping. I believe her name was Erin. She's skipping. That's great. Okay, so I'll cut this down a little bit, and I am going to grab a shot of Anthony doing some bicep curls, a little bit of running from Anthony, and I want to get some of this kettlebell action, and then at the end get Erin kind of breathing hard. Okay, so I'm gonna shorten up a couple of these things. So the first thing I like to do with any of my clips is I always like going to my color tab. So the way I can open up my color tab is I hold command hit 6, and that will open up my color filter, and I'm just gonna add a little bit of contrast. You can do it by eye. Because I've been doing this for so long, I usually go by eye, but you really should be using scopes. So if you want to open up your scopes, you hold command and press 7, and oops, I'm under saturation here. I'm gonna go to my exposure, bring it down, crush my blacks, and that gets rid of most of the noise. And already we're seeing that the footage is taking shape, and I just want to kind of give a nice little contrast to things, right? Just a nice little contrast. Okay, so that's our first layer. The second layer is we're gonna go to our filters and effects tab, and I'm gonna go under, I'm just gonna type in LUT, and I'm gonna add a custom LUT. For those of you that don't know what LUTs are, I do have a video which I'll leave a link in the description, and you can check it out. A LUT just is a short form name for lookup table, and it's actually pretty important, especially if you're gonna do this full time. LUTs save you tons and tons of time. If you're interested, I do have a LUT pack that I sell for about 15 bucks, and it gives you some really cool cinematic looks right out of the gate. All right, so I'm gonna go back to my effects window, and under my LUT, I'm gonna pick a specific LUT that I use all the time. Right off the bat, obviously it's too strong, but what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna bring down sort of the, let's say, the opacity or the strength of it. Okay, and already I like the way it looks. All I'm gonna do is just adjust a few things under my colors. So I'm just gonna kind of take out the blue a bit and make it a little bit more, have a little bit more of a dusk or a yellowy, warmer tone. And then I'm gonna add a little bit more saturation in my midtones. And I might add a little more blue to my blacks, so we have a little bit more contrast. All right, and then after that, let's see how it looks here. All right, It's looking really good. It's looking very sexy. Almost like a Nike commercial, if I might say so myself. Now this is the before. Again, this is before of our 120 frames per second. And then this is our after. Before, after, before, after. So you can see that it's taking shape. A lot of times when you're shooting 120 frames per second, sometimes the footage can look a little soft. So what I like to do is I like adding a little bit of sharpening to it. So I just added a sharpening filter to this clip, and I'm actually going to add it to the very beginning, so it's not sharpening all of the other filters, it's just sharpening the footage. And again, it's just a little extra detail, which in my opinion just allows the footage to pop a little bit more. Okay, so once we do that, really we're done. But I like always adding 2 more things just to kind of get my look the way I want it. First thing is I'm going to add film convert. So I'm going to use film convert Pro 2, and I don't really like any of the film colors from film convert. I just like the film grain. So I'm going to go and add a film grain here, my Fuji film grain, and then I'm going to change it to about 50% and have a look at this. So now we have sort of like this cinematic sort of look. And the only thing that we have left is, sometimes I do this, sometimes I don't do this, but I'm gonna try it now. I'm gonna add a curves color corrector filter, and I'm just gonna hit my blacks a little bit more and my whites a little bit more, but then I'm gonna pull up the bottom part of my blacks just to kind of give that sort of softer black tone. This may or may not work. I don't want to overdo it. There we go. So now that gives me a little bit more of a filmic type of look. So again, if you want to see how everything looks here, this is without anything. This is with all the filters. I'm going to take off that little curve, the curve that adds that little bump to it. All right, and then once I have the sort of look that I want, then all I have to do is just copy and paste and paste. Now I may change the exposure on a few of them, right? Like this one is pretty dark, this one's pretty dark. This one looks good here, and then that one's kind of dark. So I'll just like go in, and I will probably go under, I may just go under the exposure tab or the exposure option under film convert and see what that does, and just kind of bump it just a bit. So obviously you can see that, you know, you can add as much as you want, as much layers as you want, but the key ones for me is definitely sharpness. You always got to sharpen your footage, especially if it's slow-mo and the bit rate isn't the greatest. Then you add your sort of, you kind of balance it out, or you add your contrast through the normal color board. Once you're done with the color board, I always like using a LUT. If you don't have LUTs, then you can just use like your curves, or use what other tools you have, or a filter. And then I do film convert because I really like the film stock that they have. And then I add in my curves just to soften up the blacks a bit. I hope this tutorial has helped you to understand how to shoot dope, creamy, buttery smooth 120 frame slow-mo with the Sony A7 Mark III, and also how to color grade it as well, because it can be color graded and you can definitely get some dope results out of it, as you can see from the footage that I'm playing right now. If you have any questions, please leave your questions, your comments below. I'd love to hear what your focuses are on, or what some of the issues or the challenges or some of the successes that you're having with this particular tutorial. And definitely look out for many more of these types of videos. Stay positive. Peace. If you're not subscribed to the channel, I would appreciate it if you subscribe to this channel, because it is creating dope content that I hope is helping you become a dope digital storyteller. Until the next time, have a wonderful day. Peace.